Datter's law says any useful idea about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And that's really important to hold in our minds, right? Because, on one hand, it's easy to prepare for futures that sound normal, that feel like a kind of continuation of today, but it's the weird stuff that catches us off guard.
Is Datter's law trying to shock people or knock people out of the normalcy bias?
Exactly. Okay. So we all have this normalcy bias. Our brain is designed to make sense of the world in a way that doesn't overwhelm us. And so it wants to believe that patterns that have been true in the past or things that are true today will continue to be so, because if we're constantly waking up every day being like, oh, how do things work now? Like, oh, what's going on? It's too stressful, it's too overwhelming. And so the brain normally assumes things will continue as they are. But what that means is it can be very hard to kind of wake up and realize this thing that used to be true is no longer true, or this assumption I had is no longer helpful.
Jane McGonigal, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Excited to have you here. So, futurist, game designer, two things that I am obsessed with. So when I heard that your new book was coming out about that imaginable, I was immediately hooked and intrigued. I think that we're living through an incredibly disruptive, radical transformation moment. You talk about that in the book, this idea of future shock. Walk us through the whole idea of being a futurist, because you're a futurist not like in a, I'm in my garage building technology, but you're a futurist in a way that I think everybody needs to wrap their head around. You distressingly accurately predicted what we just went through in 2020 with COVID. So walk us through what it means to be a futurist and how on earth in 2010 you detailed the things that we just lived through.
Yes. Okay. So much to chew on. Well, maybe we should start with future shock, which you referenced, because people might be wondering, what is futurism? Like, where does this come from? So in 1968, Alvin Toffler wrote a book called Future Shock, and this is sort of the birth of futures thinking. And he was looking around society and noticing that people seemed overwhelmed by the rapid pace of change. And, in the 1960s, it was a very tumultuous time. There was
literally people getting shot like crazy.
Yes, social upheaval, new technologies, big economic disruptions. And he was observing the psychological impacts of change happening so fast and people feeling anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, feeling like there's too much uncertainty. They couldn't confidently plan for what was next. And he theorized that this would have a society scale toll on our collective well-being. And so he tried to invent ways of imagining what might be next. First of all, so that we could be ready for anything and not be shocked, right? And secondly, so that maybe we could learn how to be more in control of the change that happens. If we can see change starting, then we could make our own decisions about, do I want to accelerate this change? I love where the future is going. Let's make it faster. I want to be a part of it. Or do I want to try to stop it, slow it down, reverse it, mitigate the harms, control the risks? And from that 1968 book, this whole movement emerged. And I got involved with futures thinking after I finished my PhD studying the psychology of games. And one thing I learned, I was actually scouted to be a futurist, like the
Really?
Institute for the Future, which is the oldest futures organization in the world. They look for people who are actually doing things like in their garage, inventing new technologies. You probably know Alan Kay's quote that the best way to predict the future is to invent it.
Yeah.
So I was trying to invent new genres of games that would allow gamers to apply their skills to real-world problems. And the Institute said, well, sounds like you've got an idea for how the future could be different. Come make some games with us and see what happens, which is how I wound up in 2010 running, I think that was my third big future forecasting game, a simulation where tens of thousands of people, the one we did in 2010 had 20,000 people, living their lives almost like a role-playing game, like Dungeons and Dragons around a table, but instead of being around the table, you're around a social network online and you're imagining how you would react to different future crises. And that game, Evoke, we asked them to imagine a respiratory pandemic that started in China, that was complicated by misinformation, conspiracy theories by a group called Citizen X, which of course sounds like QAnon. And there were historic wildfires on the West Coast, and there was supply chain collapses. And we just asked people, what would you do? How would you try to help? This was the third big game that I did this. And not only were the forecasts, the scenarios that we asked people to imagine turned out, because that game was set 10 years in the future. So we were imagining 2020.
So bananas.
But the things that people said they would do, people really did. And it's what makes me excited about this art form, these social simulations, is, people predicted they would go to church even if they were contagious because it was so important to their identity, and that turned out to be the big super spreading risk. And people said, I'm going to go to work. You can tell me to isolate or stay home, but I need to make money. So if the government doesn't pay me to stay home, I'm going to go to work even if I'm sick. We saw that happening, and people who couldn't afford to work from home were more likely to get sick. Moms said, wait, if schools are shut down because of these issues, how am I going to take care of my kids? Am I going to become the teacher? Am I going to not be able to work? And of course, we saw a mass exodus of women from the workplace. So, there were all these social consequences that experts in public health and epidemiology did not predict, but our players, just ordinary people, knew what they would need or knew how a crisis would affect them personally. And when you collect that from 1,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 people, you can actually predict pretty accurately things that otherwise would be hard to anticipate.
So this is an idea that is hiding in plain sight, that is more transformational than I think people realize. So when I started reading your book, my wife and I play a game in business that we call No Bullshit, What Would It Take? Which you call ridiculous at first. And I have the chills. Hearing you say that, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly what Lisa and I are doing when we have these crazy big ideas that we want to do something insane. And you have to get yourself into what I look at it as a problem-solving mindset. So there are, of course, a million reasons why we're never gonna, have our kids come home from school. That would be ridiculous. Well, it's ridiculous at first, and then you begin to realize you may be thrust into a position where it's the only sensible solution. And if you stop at it's ridiculous, then you never get to that next thing, which actually allows you to predict the future pretty accurately, as you said, when you start looking at a whole group of people. But as people begin to understand, okay, hold on, if I actually get myself past the fact that this is self-evidently ridiculous, and now just no bullshit. What would it take? What would it look like? How will this play out? And they run that scenario. You can find, I think of it in terms of solutions, you can find solutions in business that other people, because they stop at the ridiculousness, they never even think through to find that there actually are all these really interesting ways that you could do it. But in your context, if you stop at, that's so ridiculous, that will never happen, then you get blindsided by 2020. Yes. So how do we, and obviously I've read the book, so I know the punchline, but how do people get into that state where they actually can essentially sit in the future? There's so many habits that are good for that. I want to pick up on, you've introduced this phrase that I love, ridiculous at first. And that comes from something that professional futurists call Datter's Law, after Jim Datter, who's another founder of the field. And Datter's Law says any useful idea about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And that's really important to hold in our minds, right? Because, on one hand, it's easy to prepare for futures that sound normal, that feel like a kind of continuation of today, but it's the weird stuff that catches us off guard. Is Datter's Law trying to shock people or knock people out of the normalcy bias?
Exactly. Okay. So we all have this normalcy bias. Our brain is designed to make sense of the world in a way that doesn't overwhelm us. And so it wants to believe that patterns that have been true in the past or things that are true today will continue to be so, because if we're constantly waking up every day being like, how do things work now? What's going on? It's too stressful, it's too overwhelming. And so the brain normally assumes things will continue as they are. But what that means is it can be very hard to kind of wake up and realize this thing that used to be true is no longer true, or this assumption I had is no longer helpful. And so we want to have these ridiculous at first ideas, one, so that we can shake ourselves from our normalcy bias, and also because the kinds of futures that we might want to make, they might be so transformative that other people say, well, that's unimaginable or that's unthinkable. A lot of people who got involved, for example, with the universal basic income movement, this idea that people just get money for nothing is so ridiculous. But we're able to prove with pilot studies and capture people's imagination to actually, let's actually take this seriously, this ridiculous at first idea. And so we also want to think of ideas that just sound absurd, because the kind of change we want is probably going, if we're thinking boldly and we're trying to really make a difference in the world, people will dismiss it. But should we talk about my favorite habit or technique for coming up with ridiculous at first ideas? So I created this brainstorming game called 100 Ways Anything Can Be Different in the Future. And it's really easy. You just make a list of things that are true today. And then you, without overthinking it, just rewrite every fact so that the opposite is now true. And then you look for clues that might explain why this upside down fact could be true. So I run this game with all kinds of organizations and communities. A few weeks ago, I was doing it with local government leaders in the state of California, so mayors and city managers and state legislators. And so one of the facts about the future, we were thinking about the future of democracy. One of their facts was, well, there's a minimum voting age in California, right? Like you have to be 18 to vote in elections. So we're coming up with this list of facts, and then we just, without thinking, just rewrite, what's the upside down version of this? There is no minimum voting age. Okay, so you just make these facts. Then you have to go look for clues. Well, one, what does it mean? There's no minimum voting age. So like babies can vote? Okay. What we do as futurists is we come up with these ridiculous at first statements, and then we just start typing them into Google. We type them into social media, and we look for people who are talking about these ideas or doing them. You can go into Google Scholar. And it turns out people are actually advocating at policy centers, serious intellectuals, that we should lower the minimum voting age to 0, because young people have the most on the line. And they're going to have to live their whole lives with the decisions that we make, especially around climate action. And so now we've got all these government leaders thinking like, oh, California, minimum voting age 0, what would that mean? And I always, when we come up with these ideas, I always ask like, well, what's your emotional reaction? Would you be excited to wake up in this future? Would you be worried? I had no idea what they would say. I thought maybe they would really hate this future because it's so weird. And they really liked it. Most of them rated on a scale. We do like a scale of 1 to 10. How excited are you? And they were like 7, 8, 9. So I'm like, I'm getting ready. Just even for me, that's a signal of change that people working in government were so intrigued by such a strange idea.
And how do you, because one thing that I liked in your book is you encourage people to don't just Pollyanna, don't just negative think. How do you get people to balance that? Because like in California, if I run the thought experiment, it's a one-party state. I get why they would love it. But if you have a more contentious state, then it becomes who has the most offspring. Because of course, if you have a 3-year-old, they're going to vote the way that you want them to. So how do you help people navigate second and third order consequences as they think through a future that they want to create?
So that's a great question. First of all, you could definitely crunch some numbers and you could try to figure out like what would shift, how would the power of balance shift? Running thought experiments on that already. It seems like younger voters probably would really change just the political landscape. I mean, if you're having, especially, kids are going to vote the way their parents want, but teenagers, preteens, it does kind of change what might become central election issues, which I think is exciting, but it might not pan out in the ways that we think. But we have a tool called Draw Out Consequences, where we do basically chains of causes and effects. Okay, if this happened, then what would happen? And that happened, then what would happen? And you try to create these chains to get to kind of surprising outlier consequences. But the simplest thing you can do whenever I have a scenario is before we start playing with it, everybody has to think of one thing that they would be excited about or one thing that could go right in this future, something would be better in this world, and one thing that could go wrong or one thing they would be worried about. So if we have like 500 people coming to play with a scenario, we instantly have a list of like 500 possible, benefits, but also 500 risks. And then that sets the groundwork for, as we try to draw out these consequences, people can say like, oh, okay, let me think about that. Well, what might happen then? And so we do try to have this balance of positive and shadow imagination, because really any future is going to have complications, but also perhaps unexpected benefits where people use it as an opportunity to create positive change. Even with the pandemic, I mean, many people are trying to use this as an opportunity to rethink how we do things, might wind up having lasting positive impacts on work or learning.
Now, one thing that I know you've looked at, certainly on the game side, is that people don't always make rational decisions. So one thing I found really interesting when I first became aware of economics, there was still sort of the lingering tale of humans make perfectly rational decisions. And my first introduction to the fact that we don't was Dan Ariely and his idea of predictably irrational, that we are far more complex and bizarre creatures than we think we are, that people will lie, but only to the point where it doesn't change their internal sense of I'm not a liar. Like he, points out all these really interesting facts. So one, you're crowdsourcing the future predictions, which makes a lot of sense, which will take into account then all of the different biases and the fact that people are different and, they aim at different things. But as you think about at an individual level, how do you bake in the predictably irrational parts of the human psyche?
I actually spend a lot of time asking people how they would feel in different futures. And I have this whole set of emotions. This is not something I write about in the books. This is kind of fun that you're asking. It's like another tool that I didn't have room for. And we have this whole set of emotions. And we ask people like, okay, can you imagine, we're playing the idea of the next pandemic. Let's say the next pandemic, it's not a contagious virus, it's tick-borne. So you
freaked me out with that in the book. I was like, oh God.
Yeah, get ready. We're all going to be wearing our socks like above our pants, and that's going to be good fashion. So get ready to trend set.
The detailed way that you walk people through this alpha-gal.
Yeah, alpha-gal crisis.
Was unnerving, given that you did this 10 years ago with the pandemic. So not to derail us from the point you were about to make, but how accurate do you think that prediction is?
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay, let's follow the chain. I love it. You're like laying out all these breadcrumbs for me to follow. I feel like Hansel and Gretel. Okay, so I asked people like, what can you imagine a time where you might feel embarrassed if you were living in this scenario, or a time you would feel proud, or a time that you would feel loved or grateful? And we try to create a landscape of stories. It becomes a story that we're all telling together. And it helps me understand what might drive behavior if we understand, what are people angry about in this future, or what are people grateful for. It really helps you get a much more nuanced sense of, as you said, these irrational decisions we make. When we were playing with pandemics back in 2008 and 2010, we had people wear masks in their everyday lives. The players, we had about 8,000 people. We said, wear these to school, wear these to parties, wear it on public transportation, and tell us how it feels. And just based on how it felt emotionally to these individuals and, physically what they were reporting, we knew early in 2020, it was going to be very hard to convince people to adopt this new behavior, even though it seems so rational, right? So we ask these questions about feelings. That's how we try to bake it in. The alpha-gal crisis is definitely, I think it's very realistic. I think, we will absolutely be living in a future where more people have been sensitized to this sugar molecule, right? So there's a disease, it's called alpha-gal syndrome.
It's from being bitten by a tick.
It's being bitten by a tick.
Is it a cousin of Lyme disease? Is it related to Lyme disease? Just same creature that passes it on?
Yeah, so the tick has this molecule, this sugar molecule in it, and it comes from how it from deer and things like that, and it accidentally mixes with your blood. So when it's biting you, some of this sugar molecule from the tick gets injected into your bloodstream, and your immune system reacts like it's the bubonic plague. It's really just it's literally just sugar. It's something that's in animal products like beef or gelatin. But your body, because it came in this weird way into your bloodstream from a bite, your body says, okay, whenever I see this, we're going full, 5-alarm fire. And people develop severe allergic reactions to any animal product, not just getting bitten again, but if they, eat a vitamin gummy that has gelatin in it, or they have
Is it
some
any
meat.
animal product or mammals?
Mammalian meat products, right. But which is in more things than you realize, right? Like a lot of toilet paper is made with gelatin to be soft, So you have to literally in this future, you might have people carrying around, like their own toilet paper the way we're, carrying around sanitizer now. And we think about these details just to help people imagine it. Will we definitely live in a world where, 10% of Americans have this or more. Already in the United States, in the southeastern section, more than a third of people, when you just randomly pick people off the street and test their blood, they've already been bitten and already sensitized.
Wow.
So, 1 or 2 more bites, or if they continue to eat a diet that's really high in mammalian meat products, every time you get exposed, it increases your allergic risk. So we definitely could see this. It depends on what we do. Like any future scenario, one of the reasons why we want to imagine it before it happens is maybe we could change it. It's not inevitable that we will continue to change our environment so that tick populations grow. It's not inevitable that we'll eat diets that put us at risk. I mean, there are lots of ways. It's not inevitable that scientists won't, figure out a treatment, right? There are so many pathways to affect this future. The reason we imagine it now is, one, to just prepare ourselves with knowledge. I mean, I, for one, definitely am more conscious about being tick safe just because I don't need any more spice in my life right now. And that if it does start to unfold, I won't be shocked. I won't be frozen in old ways of doing things. I'll be able to adapt faster. But also to lend my support to people who might be trying to prevent this future in any way I can. So yeah, it's not inevitable. But I mean, for sure, it's something we should be ready for because it's already happening. These signals of change are already underway.
Yeah. So walk me through why it's beneficial to think through this stuff. So as somebody that has struggled with anxiety, I know that you can get yourself in a twist by rehearsing what I call rehearsing failure. So you're obsessing, like I used to think of it as, well, I'm just planning my escape route. So if I get into a situation, my anxiety goes crazy, like how am I going to back out of this? And what I found was, this meeting or whatever I'm about to go in, I'm just thinking of the 30 ways that it could go wrong so that I have an escape hatch for each one of them. But once I flipped a switch and said, I'm just going to let the disastrous scenario catch me off guard so that I'm only rehearsing the success.
What you want, yeah.
So I'm looking at the 30 ways that it could go right, making sure that I'm ready for those, that I know how to move in that case. And what it was doing was just literally obliterating my what I call background radiation, my anxieties, my fears. They never had a chance to incubate because I wasn't giving them any energy. Now, that means that at some point I'm going to get totally caught off guard and be like, whoa, I did not see that coming because I've only thought about the good things. But when I think about the dramatic reduction in anxiety that it brought to focus on, this is going to work, this is going to be amazing, imagining myself winning, that was really helpful. But in the book, you explain something, and I bought into it totally, that there actually is, certainly in this sort of anti-future shock way, there's a real benefit to thinking through this stuff.
Yeah, and I will say, when I first started working in this space, I did not expect people to feel less anxiety by imagining these catastrophes. I actually felt bad. I would, because I'd been making, more traditional video games, and I was inviting people who liked my work to come play with these scenarios. I'm like, I know it sounds scary, but it'll be fun, trust me. And I didn't know if it would work, but over, more than a decade of doing this, people come out of imagining these scenarios fired up, super empowered. It's part of why I wanted to write this book, to dig into the psychology and neuroscience, because it doesn't initially seem to make sense. There are a couple key factors to it. And by the way, I say, like, it's not enough just to like read about these scenarios or talk about them or like listen to a podcast or watch a show. You will feel anxious. What changes people's mindset is playing with the scenarios. It's like if you're hungry and you just look at a plate of food, it doesn't help. You have to eat it. So you have to actually play with these scenarios. If you just read about them or listen, it doesn't have the same transformative effect. But so the first thing, the biggest thing, if you vividly imagine something, and you only need to do it for 5 minutes, so you don't have to, every day wake up, what am I doing to prepare? Like literally you do this one time in your life for 5 minutes so that your brain is essentially, you overcome the normalcy bias and it becomes something your brain believes is possible. Okay, so like one of the scenarios in the book is a government mandated internet shutdown for cybersecurity reasons. Just turn off the internet for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and governments around the world are doing this now. So how would you prepare for that? And you imagine it literally for 5 minutes. Okay, then just file it away. What happens is if you wake up and the future you imagined is now happening, instead of being shocked or denying it, like this can't be real, that slows people down, they're not able to adapt or act quickly, your brain actually has a positive emotion, which is pre-recognition. Your brain says, yeah, I knew this could happen. Like I was smart enough to take this possibility seriously. And that doesn't mean you were able to prevent it or stop it from happening, but it's a positive emotion. It gives you confidence. It gives you a sense of readiness and clarity. And to start your process of having to adapt or deal with a crisis or disruption from a state of confidence and clarity rather than anxiety, confusion, feeling helpless, it really changes the way that you emotionally experience things that can create a lot of suffering. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when I have people play with scenarios, the big thing we focus on is what would you do to help others? Also, what kind of help would you need? And it becomes like a matchmaking, right? People are saying like, oh, this would be a problem for me. And I'm like, oh, I have a solution for that. And this is actually an incredible way to build confidence for any situation. We kind of get out of our own head and think about being of service to other people. And that service mentality, that identifying our skills and our strengths and our values and passions that would, help someone else in a crisis. That allows us to think about these hypothetical possibilities, again, from a position of strength, of confidence, of being ready, and it gives us more insight into our own strengths and skills that we don't have to wait for an actual catastrophe, right? We might start to get more in touch with the kinds of actions or businesses that would be something we could do today. So people tend to leave these scenarios fired up, which is good. And I did not expect that. It's something I had to watch happen again and again as players participated. And to this day, the alpha-gal syndrome, I was just saying at a book event last night, people love this scenario, and I was really surprised. I thought it might like traumatize people, especially coming out of one pandemic to think of another pandemic. But what I learned is people want the opportunity to imagine us doing better. We did kind of not a great job with this pandemic. So they're like, they want to imagine what's the next version where everything, goes better. And even the host of this event, she was like, yeah, I love that scenario too. It was my favorite. So it's like, you just can't imagine until you actually start imagining how something that seems so stressful could actually make you feel good. But
talk to me about the degree of specificity. That was one thing that I found really interesting. Like even with the alpha gal thing in the book, you really go into like, here's how entrepreneurs will react. And I was like, wow, that really is true. And that it was so obviously predictable. Once you start thinking, okay, what would entrepreneurs do? What would moms do? What would businesses do? Like it was really interesting. But you have this like hyper degree of specificity that you encourage people to do. Not it's heavy, it's 100 pounds, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, so one technique for bringing specificity to these scenarios is we ask you to just live with it, almost like an augmented reality layer on top of your everyday life.
Just in your imagination.
Yeah, it's like just like kind of background imagination. It's like so you might go into a cafe, like a coffee shop, and be like, okay, if we were living in an alpha-gal crisis, what would be different here? Or you're going to like a backyard cookout. One of the things that I learned in researching this scenario is that if you have this syndrome, just smelling airborne meat can send you into anaphylactic shock.
That is crazy.
It's super crazy. So then I start imagining, well, I have lots of friends who like cookout culture is important to them. So what are they doing on weekends? Does this become the new social division between people who have to mask up around meat? Or do we adapt? Do we like come up with new cultures? What's the new pregame or the new backyard ritual? And I can't predict on my own what the specificity would be. But when you have lots of people looking at the things they care about, we did an oil crisis simulation years ago, and one of the most enthusiastic participation groups was NASCAR enthusiasts. And they were like, we have to be able to imagine how the sport could continue even in the absence of traditional fuel. And so if you look at a scenario from what you love, from what you know, what you have your own lived experience or expertise with, then you can get specific. And so for me, I might look at things like running. How does running culture change? Or how does being a mom change? Or how does gaming industry react? And so you bring your expertise, and suddenly it's not, if we're thinking about it in the abstract, we just have a really hard time. But then it gets, when we bring our own, our whole selves to it, we realize we have so much information about what could change just based on our own wisdom that we bring to the future.
All right, my friend, I have a big announcement. My incredible and talented wife, Lisa, is about to launch her new book, Radical Confidence. In it, she has managed to perfectly capture the process of how to go from feeling lost and insecure to taking control of your life and doing amazing things despite feeling fear, sometimes a lot of fear. Now, let me tell you, nobody knows Lisa better than me, but when I read Radical Confidence for the first time and heard her describe what it was like for her to go from having these big, exciting dreams as a kid to then as an adult scheduling her life around the TV shows that she wanted to watch, or how lonely and isolated she felt instead of pursuing her dreams, it was brutal for me. I would never say, though, that it was worth it for her to go through all of that just so that she could write something down that allows others to avoid it. But I will say that at least she was able to capture the strategies that she used to break out of that rut, find her voice, and begin doing incredible things despite her insecurities and fears that she wasn't going to be good enough to achieve great things. So while it hurts me to know the dark place that Lisa went through, I really am excited for people who are going through something similar right now to read this book. Radical Confidence is an instruction manual for how to become the hero of your own life, even when you're scared to death. Look, I know better than just about anybody how easy it is to get off track in life or to just not have yet found your calling. And it's even easier for people to feel so insecure and unprepared that they don't even want to pursue the things that they want. But what Lisa shows people in Radical Confidence is that the radical part is that you can accomplish extraordinary things even when you feel fear. That's what Radical Confidence is. Being afraid and unsure and having a toolkit that allows you to still make massive progress. Pre-order your copy today, because if you act now, you can claim the bonuses that Lisa has created for you at radicalconfidence.com. They're only available if you pre-order, so act now. Then, once you've done that, we'll get back to today's episode. All right, guys, read the book and get ready to be the hero of your own life. Peace out. Yeah, one thing that as an exercise I found really interesting in the book, and I could see how it would play out well. And in the book, you give 3 scenarios, if I remember right, and you're like, I want you to spend the next 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever, actually living it like you were just explaining. But like, okay, hey, you're gonna have to wear a mask as you go to the barbecue. What kind of mask do you wear?
Yeah.
Oh, you wear your favorite football team. Amazing. What does it feel like? Is it rough? Is it smooth? And like, something interesting happens to the brain when you force yourself to keep answering these layers of questions, like the visual starts to become real and you can really internalize it, versus So here's an interesting idea. I very rarely talk about this out loud. Be curious to hear your thoughts. So in business, there's a concept I'm always trying to get young entrepreneurs to understand, that emotions will make dots feel like they connect that don't actually connect. Because your brain just sort of smooths it in, fills in the gaps. You imagine like alpha-gal crisis, yeah, I would be fine. I would just avoid the ticks in the woods. But you're not really getting in to understand, no, now they're migrating to the beaches and they're, whatever, 10 times more present than they were. This is not some minor thing, like it's really escalating. And so getting out of emotion and getting into what I tell people to do is journal, because you need to be able to write it down in a single sentence.
Yes.
So that got a reaction. So
well, yeah, I mean, my favorite technique is journaling from the future. When people ask me, like, what can I do to really benefit from playing with a scenario? I say, well, write a journal entry, could free write for 5 minutes, but you have a goal. Your goal is to get as many vivid details into this journal entry as possible, and I want you to score yourself afterwards. I want you to go back and count out, how many visual details, colors, shapes, how many auditory details. Were you describing something you could hear? Tactile details. If you were talking to someone, did you write down, the words that came out of their mouth? So you can tally up the number of details. The more detailed your journal entry, the more effective it seems to be for increasing your ability to think strategically and creatively about a future and to overcome the normalcy bias, right? If you have 3 details, like, you might need to try again. 30 details, you're done, you're ready. And when we really want to create deep understanding of a scenario, we do have people do it for at least 10 days. So every day for 10 days, take something you're actually doing. Okay, so I'm, getting dressed this morning. Okay, what am I wearing in this future that is different from what I would wear today? And how am I making that decision? And how do I feel about it? How do I look? And sometimes people will, it's not just writing. You can take selfies from the future. You can kind of create
how do you
artifacts.
take selfies from the future?
Well, so one of the scenarios in the book is imagining a mass climate migration, and there's a political movement to be more supportive of people who have to move due to extreme heat or drought. And the party, it's called the Welcome Party, right? We should be welcoming. So I just made a T-shirt with Welcome Party on it, and the symbol of this, fictional party is a monarch butterfly. So I'm drawing monarch butterflies on it. And
And you made that up, the symbol and all that stuff.
Yeah. To help people imagine, right? And we have ideas, like you could take a picture of a monarch butterfly and put it in your window as like a sign to other. It's like, this is a safe house. Like if you are
so tell
fleeing
that you're a
climate
game
change.
developer. This is
right. We're looking
so cool.
building the details. And so, that's one of the skills that I do try to teach in the book is how do you create visual artifacts of the future, symbols, things you can wear, things you can show others. And then, take photos, put it on social media, start a conversation, or have someone ask you, like, what's the welcome party? Oh, let me tell you about this weird scenario. I'm trying to figure out when I would move, and if I would move, where I would go. And if I had to go, what would I need? And would it be, are there laws to support it? Could I fund, am I ready? Do I have the language skills? And so we create these, things that spark conversation. You're writing these journal entries, and you're doing it every day for 10 days, and you're making your artifacts and taking your selfies. And if you do it for 10 days, around 10 different things that or activities you do or communities that you're a part of, you get this incredibly rich view of a future where you've essentially turned yourself into an expert on this future. The most people that I've had participate in one of these, long form explorations of a scenario was about 20,000. And I would like to see, 200,000 or 2 million, and hoping that we start to build this as a skill set and a practice, because we want people to have deep expertise about the future before it happens, not just, some, futurist nerds who can see it coming.
So speaking of things that futurist nerds can see coming, let's talk about cryptocurrency. So the more I look at, Getting into crypto has really reframed my sense of what the future is going to be. Ray Dalio has really formed like what my sense of the future is going to be. And when I put them together, I do worry that we're coming into some pretty rocky times. And so I know you speak very intelligently around cryptocurrency. So have you run any scenarios around this? Have you done this kind of gamification around it? What do you see?
I mean, look, the future that I'm encouraging people to be ready for is significant government regulation and in governments having their own cryptocurrency alternative. So trying to understand what would a central bank digital currency look like? How would it operate?
How did you
incentives?
get to, I think, and maybe this is exactly where you're going. So as you try to predict that, what are you thinking about in terms of like, what made you think, oh, the governments will run their own?
Well, so, I mean, look, the bread and butter of future forecasting is collecting signals of change, right? So it's our...
From what's already happening.
From what's already happening. It's our raw material. And so, we have this huge database at the Institute for the Future. All of our researchers, we are required, ideally every day, at least one signal of change that you're seeing, and we look for trends and patterns. One important signal of change is that literally every government that has a sovereign currency is experimenting, is planning. They are looking at it. They have teams tasked with designing a cryptocurrency for the federal government. Another signal that I found absolutely fascinating is China's decision to launch its own national cryptocurrency and to give it away for free. So how do we make this currency popular? How do we start to, we don't want to just have to ban Bitcoin. We want to entice people to say, I would rather be a part of this ecosystem because the government's giving it to me for free, and they were getting different companies to offer incentives to use it.
So is the digital yuan already rolled out?
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. I knew that it was coming.
Yeah.
And I knew that they booted Bitcoin, but I didn't know they'd already rolled it out.
Now, and it depends on, what nations do you think will be essentially cultural thought leaders in the coming decades? A lot of nations look to China now as the ideal, able
Rising
to respond
world power.
quickly, that combination of authoritarian power, but bold, sweeping future visions. They're not trying to go backwards, they're trying to go forwards. If you ask just ordinary people in many countries around the world, they'll say, well, we'd rather be like China than like the US. So when a government does something like that that's an important signal to look at. And, we see the signals growing. The current Biden administration just announced, I think a couple weeks ago, that they're starting their own development of a central bank digital currency. And then the other, why do I think this is plausible? I mean, there's so many cool things, as you know, that you can do with programmable money. It makes sense that governments would want to have this. It's such a more powerful way to stimulate and impact the economy. So if you want to give out cash stimulus, but you don't want people to just save it because you're trying to provoke spending, you can send out programmable money that expires in 30 days, or you can make it location specific. You can only spend it in this region that was hit by, a hurricane they're trying to rebuild. There are really cool things you can do with it. You can have money that accrues negative interest if you save it, right? So let's say you don't want a company like Apple sitting on piles of cash, right? It shrinks instead of accruing interest. It gets, you have less money if you're not spending it. So just the fact that you can do so many powerful things makes it seem pretty obvious that governments are going to want to have that power and use it. And they will probably try to regulate the existing cryptocurrency market and industry in order to be able to create demand for their own product. And there are definitely reasons to be worried about such a future. I also think, I think there's some really cool aspects to it. I mean, I could see reasons to be excited for the government having this infrastructure. So we try to keep that balance of positive and shadow imagination, because if you're only worried about it, then you won't see the reasons why it would happen. And you have to be aware of other people's positive motivations and why they're excited about it, or then you really will be blindsided. You know, this will never happen because it's obviously a terrible idea.
Yeah, that brings me back to Ray Dalio. So he catches a lot of flack because he's very, I mean, he might say just sort of objective, but I'll say he's pretty positive about China and what he's watched them do. And he's always like, you can't judge like somebody else's value system. You can say that it's not yours, but you can't judge their value system. And it's interesting to see how this will play out around different value systems, how people think about it. There is certainly a shadow imagination side to the traceability of what will certainly happen with the governments having a digital currency that they can track everything. Like somehow, because of Bitcoin's early, like when it was under the radar, people made the mistake of thinking that that was a wise way to do criminal behavior. That's the worst possible way ever. Literally, they can go back and track money from 10 years ago. So that would be really, really absurd. And so, of course, that will be a feature, not a bug of anything that governments do, which does make me worry a little. But in terms of value going digital, it's going to happen.
And it's, as you said, it's a value system. One of the things I always try to stretch people's imagination around is the competing values of privacy and transparency or accountability. We know in China, it's not just from the government. Culture-wide, there's more of a value for transparency and accountability. And so when you look at all the facial recognition technology that's being rolled out there, to a lot of Americans, this sounds like a dystopian nightmare, but people there will say, well, I feel safer, or there's been positive change, people change their behaviors, people in my community, they're better people now. Now, that doesn't mean, I'm not a supporter of, any, but the idea that we would never allow that technology to gain a foothold in American society, I think a lot of people believe that. They believe that the value of privacy is so strong that we're not going to see mass adoption of this technology, which is a mistake. And one signal of change that I look at here is when law enforcement started using information, the genetic data information from people uploading their DNA to get their ancestry.
I didn't know they were doing this.
Oh, yeah, that's how they caught the Golden State Killer.
What?
Yeah. Oh, so
Tell me more.
Well, as somebody who grew up terrified of all these serial killers who were never caught, I mean, I'm actually quite excited that law enforcement now, they can go to 23andMe and they can search for relatives if they have DNA from a suspect. They can figure out, okay, well, here's somebody, this is like a second cousin. Let's look for all of their cousins. And they've identified some of the most notorious unsolved, serial
How did I not hear about this?
I don't know, but for me, it was like I could finally sleep at night. I mean, these people loom large in my anxiety. Now, when law enforcement first started doing this, there were all of these thought pieces, like opinion pieces about this is an invasion of privacy. People don't expect when they upload their data to learn what are my ancestral origins. They don't expect it to be turned over to law enforcement. So there was this sense that maybe there would be a regulation, we would stop this, we would crack down. What they didn't anticipate is how excited so many people would be, women in particular, that people who for decades were committing these acts of violence are now brought to justice. And now imagine living in a world where that kind of criminal activity is no longer possible to undertake in the same way. Again, I'm not saying the technology is good or bad, or this is totally a utopian situation. But if you are blind to why some people might look at it as an invasion of privacy, other people look at it as a relief, thank God at last people will be held accountable. We have to hold these competing values in mind, as you said, because the world may decide to go in a different direction. Yeah. And just because privacy has been one of our highest values in the United States for however many centuries now, doesn't mean it will continue. And we have to be really mindful of what people actually feel and what they actually want. And it might challenge our assumptions.
Signals of change, man. You've put words to something that, to your point about future shock and this feeling a bit like the 60s, where changes is suddenly happening at such a radical pace. There are so many signals of change happening right now, some good, some bad, and it will be very interesting to see, because if people are dismissing it and they're not looking at it going, okay, this is a signal, man. This is not like you should or could dismiss this. Yeah. Like, it really needs to be the thing that informs how you think through what the future is going to look like. So I don't know if you know who Raoul Pal is, but he's very big in the cryptocurrency world. Okay. He's a macro investor. And he said something, and when I was reading your book, I was like, oh my God, like this is so, you're the missing link between this notion that Raoul Pal has. And so this is what he says is the secret to his success. He says he steps into the future, and then he looks back and says, what would have to have been true for us to end up here? Yeah. But the part that's always been missing is, how do you step into the future? And so your idea of the journaling and the creating details and the really taking these signals of change and like amplifying them and where do they go, that allows you to get into the future. And then you can look back and say, okay, either what would we have to do to change this so that we don't end up in this imagined future, but at least you have a sense of what that imagined future is, so you can be looking backwards. I think you quote in your book that idea of it's a sad memory that can only be used in the future looking backwards.
It's a poor form of memory that only works backwards. That's Lewis Carroll. It's from one of his Alice in Wonderland
Such
stories.
A cool idea.
Yeah, and so I think most people are familiar with the term future forecasting. So we also have this term future backcasting. And it's particularly useful when you have a future that you want to wake up in. I want to wake up in a world where 3-day work week is the new norm, let's say. Or I want to wake up in a world where cars are banned in Los Angeles. Whatever, we have a feeling like, I think this would be a great future. Now, we probably want to imagine in detail, look for unanticipated consequences to make sure we really want the future. But let's say you've got a future you want. Then you backcast, and you can go back and we do a lot of news headlines from the future where we try to imagine, tell us, each year, what was the pivotal news story that reflects this process of change or this escalation of an idea or a movement or a behavior. And so, backcasting is really great. It's especially great when you have a future that you want. And while for whatever reason, I have personally more fun imagining the futures we don't want, that's my sort of jam. I think a lot of people will be more inspired and motivated to really articulate those best case scenario futures while I'm over here doing the worst case ones, and imagining that vividly, and then doing this backcasting, because it just gives you ideas for what to do. And I always say, try to backcast all the way to as far as, what could you do in the next 24 hours to make this future more likely? Just force yourself to roll up your sleeves and do something to start trying to have an impact on this future.
And I'd be so curious to know how that breaks along gender lines. The whole idea, so reading about the female brain and what's the difference between the male and female, you've got, so men, there's no real investment in having children. It's the cost of producing sperm. Right. Whereas for women, that's like a real thing, 9 months plus, caretaking beyond that. And I heard it described that females have a detective's brain, which is why they're interested in serial killers. My wife is obsessed. Every time I turn around, someone is shrieking, getting stabbed to death on the TV. And I'm like, how do you watch this stuff?
Yeah.
And that has been anecdotally like a thing in my life where, women will get together and talk about, oh yeah, watching the serial killer show, or they just have a real deep fascination with that. And the thought of you, imagining the ways that things could go wrong so that you can backcast and make sure that we don't end up there. I don't know that you would be alone in that. I think that my sort of hypothesis, and who knows if I'm right, but my hypothesis would be that there would be a disproportionate number of women who really want to look at that, that their mind just gravitates to, how do I avoid this bad thing, which brings a real genius to the equation, because if somebody isn't doing that, then we're really going to be in trouble.
You know, I mean, it's a good instinct you have, a good intuition you have. When I think about who shows up to participate in these simulations and to play these future forecasting games, there is a slight majority women who show up. So, which is not true for the field. I mean, the field of future forecasting historically has been predominantly men, but when it comes to actually playing these games, we do see a lot of women do. So maybe it's our detective mind. I like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Very interesting. All right, I would be super remiss as somebody. So right now at Impact Theory, we are developing I hesitate to call it a video game, but it's so close to that we'll just, for now, we'll round it to that. But I have a very strong thesis that video games in the next 3 to 5 years are not going to look like, there will still be all the classic games that we have now because they're just amazingly fun. Those will all exist. But there will be this new kind of gaming, a better way to say it, that will come out of Web3. And so what makes Web3 interesting to me is what I'll call wallet-aware encounters. So I need better names for all this stuff because it sounds sort of unsexy, and I think it's the coolest thing in the world. But have you read Ready Player One?
Of course.
Okay, so huge difference between the movie and the book. But in the book, he describes what I think this new wave of Web3 gaming is going to be, which I will call game-like experiences. So you've got even in the book, you've got the sort of battle royale style where we're in a combat zone and we're doing our thing. But then in the book, it's probably 95% is a non-combat zone, and it's all these weird experiences.
Yeah.
Somebody builds a replica of their hometown, and you can go in, and if you go in the arcade and you beat this game, then it opens this door, and you go in and you meet this person. And that, to me, is where a lot of new style gaming is going to be, because I can look at your wallet as technology, and inside of your wallet will be what I'll call affinity cues. So you'll tell me what you're into just by what you own. And so I can see that, and I can customize an experience. And then, so that's sort of early phase one, right? So my wife has a book coming up called Radical Confidence, and we're doing an NFT drop around it. She's got this whole thing in real life. She really does this. That she calls her bad bitch boots. And so she has struggled with insecurity, and so she found ways to sort of build herself up through her clothes and self-signaling and all this stuff. So we're going to make these 3D boots. And then if you have those boots on, then we can create an experience for you. You walk in and let's say that we create an experience where you meet Lisa and some of her other entrepreneurial friends, and you're suddenly in this space, and it's game-like, but it's not like you're collecting coins or shooting people. It's a different kind of game experience, but cued off of this thing that you have in your wallets. Now, and the reason that I'm bringing this up to you is rule number 1 of game design: find the fun. Yeah. Have you thought through, because you're doing this in real life, in fact, I would call these things, Evoke and the other one that you did, as sort of game-like experiences.
Yes.
So again, I'm not collecting coins, but there is I'm a part of a group. There are more people playing it. We're coming back and we're sharing something. And so there's this sense of, like you said, it's an RPG. Have you thought at all about sort of where Web3 goes from here and what this looks like?
Yeah, I mean, my research on Web3 and gaming has been primarily around getting paid to play and what the new economies might be like. So I will start by saying what you describe sounds really interesting. So I will be paying attention to it as a new signal of change and putting it into our Institute for the Future database. So thank you for putting that on my radar. I mean, my own, I would say it was almost 10 years ago, I was doing a big forecast for a Chinese game company. And the core of my forecast was, in the future, people will expect to generate income from playing your games. And this idea that gamers pay you for your game is going to be completely flipped upside down, that there are going to be incredible revenue streams around gaming and through gaming and owning our assets and being paid by the game companies for the value that we create. Because most games, the real value is from the community of players, the esteem that you give each other, the ingenuity and creativity that you bring to these worlds. And so, get ready for a totally new financial ecosystem. And they thought it was the most ridiculous idea. Not ridiculous at first, but ridiculous. They're like, we just don't. They're like, game companies would never agree to. We're just not. The revenue's just not going to be shared. It's just not going to happen. And
What year was this?
I want to say it was like 2015, maybe.
Whoa.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
I need to be following everything that you guys are doing way more closely. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know how you came to that fast, but damn.
I think I gave a talk at the RSA conference at Moscone about this, maybe about 5 years ago, where I was laying out all the signals. But so, yeah, for me, that's a real interest, and to think about not just how it changes gaming, but how it changes work. And, you know, if you can create essentially a basic income for yourself through playing, what kinds of work might you not be willing to do? I mean, it's already hard enough now to get people to do low wage work. If there are alternatives that are more like things that we naturally have a passion for, we're really gonna have to rethink who does the rest of the work. And so it's exciting. I think it's exciting. That's where my research around Web3 has been. So,
have you been paying attention to what I'll call a sort of civil war between traditional gamers and Web3 gamers?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
What do you think is driving that? Because there is so much vitriol. It's insane.
Well, I mean, one of the big problems is that traditional gaming is using this technology to extract more money from players, not to share the revenue with them. And so I think, you know, the traditional gaming community sees it as a cash grab rather than trying to innovate for the good of the gaming ecosystem or community. You know, they're trying to sell NFTs to get more money. But they're not making a persuasive case that this is actually going to benefit gamers by participating in this. And I think that's where a lot of the friction is right now. It's just, nobody's presented within traditional gaming a convincing case that, well, if we bring this technology into these communities, that it will have benefit. So I think.
So they're thinking that the game companies are using NFTs as a way to be further sort of parasitic?
Extractive, yeah. Like, you know, I mean, gamers and game developers have had a difficult relationship since, in some ways, since the shift to freemium models, where oh yeah, it's, you know, free to play, but then they keep trying to get you to pay for more moves or more energy and all these upgrades and access, and there's this sort of nostalgia for the day where I could just buy a game and play it, and I didn't feel like I was constantly someone trying to pick my pocket all the time, and it created a sort of adversarial relationship. I still, every time I do an interview and somebody's interested, they're like, we got to talk about game economics. It's so exploitative. People feel really, there was this feeling of being abused and exploited by the new game economic models. And so I think that, it's essentially a kind of trauma that the game industry inflicted on its own community. And so I think it's hard to see clearly if there are opportunities with this technology, because so many gamers are used to, I would say, more of a bad faith. And game companies are moving away from it now. Fortnite was kind of a breakthrough, right? Where, yes, you can pay more money, but it doesn't give you an advantage in the game, right? It's more expressive and status, but you can't pay your way to the top. And that felt more fair. It felt like a more just economic model. And so I think we just need to kind of live through fair economies in gaming for this to make sense and build any real interest or enthusiasm.
Yeah, it's interesting being on the Web3 side of this and being like, oh man, gamers are going to love this, because I'm an avid gamer, old school gaming, been gaming since Atari. Even still to this day, I game. And I was so smitten with Web3. As soon as I got what it was going to be, I was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And so then really expected, games will be like one of the first places that this is adopted. You now own your skin, and it's not just, you know, something that you have, but you can't really sell it. And then, you know, you watch enough YouTube videos and you realize, whoa, like there's this real pushback. But from the Web3 side, it's like, I get it, because if you're thinking that this is just going to be a siphoning tool that the game developers are going to use, and maybe it is, maybe that's what traditional games will do with it, but they will ultimately be supplanted by games on the Web3 side. My only beef is that the Web3 side is approaching it from play to earn instead of play and earn, which I think is also going to have its moment of like where we watch game economies collapse in on itself. And
there has to be an intrinsic value to the game, right? To be sustainable. I want to make money playing my favorite games, not some weird new system. You know what I want to say? I think one of the biggest problems where this like movement is shooting itself in the foot accidentally with gamers is how the idea of a metaverse, a singular metaverse where you can have interoperability, really sounds naive to game developers, because
naive.
We don't want, like I don't want you bringing your Fortnite weapons onto my Animal Crossing island. What am I supposed to do? Do you know what I'm like? Okay, you got it. I think that's another. It's like it's not just from a technological standpoint, it's from a cultural, social standpoint. We don't actually want interoperability of all of these Web3 assets, in the sense that we don't, like, you may design things that I don't want to exist in my experience. So getting back to what you're creating, this idea that in my wallet, you'll have my affinities and you'll know me, so you know not to bring any weapons onto my island. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and it sounds like a much more plausible way to get to a future where we do see that integration of the gameful experience with this tech.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's going to happen is, so it's what I call the metaverse archipelago. So right now, and the bet that we're making is that it's going to be Unreal Engine. And you've got a bunch of people in the Web3 space developing games inside of Unreal Engine. And that, if they do what I'm talking about, these game-like experiences, then you've really got a shot, because there's parts of the game that don't require weapons, so we don't have to worry about balancing and things like that. But if you're just walking around the experiential side of the game, then you've got your consistent identity, which I think will be a big thing. Jen, I could talk to you about this stuff forever.
We will talk about it again. I think let's stay in conversation, because I'm excited about what you're doing.
Absolutely. So I'm going to now be obsessively following every word out of your mouth, given your ability to predict the future.
Fair.
Where can other people do the same?
So besides the book, which is called Imaginable, we also just opened at the Institute for the Future our first public center for social simulation and imagination training. It's called Urgent Optimists, plural, because there's a bunch of us, .org. And you can come and get a new scenario every month and play these games with me and find other people reading Imaginable and work through the games and scenarios together.
I love it. Guys, she's helping us all predict the future. I can't say anything more powerful than that in terms of reasons to go read the book. Following her, you will be richly rewarded. And speaking of things that will reward you, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace.